Night had folded over Rome like a heavy cloth, and the stone ribs of the narrow streets held the day's heat and the day's hush. Inside the Sistine Chapel, voices had just fallen away. A choir's last chord had sunk into the painted ceiling and lingered there like smoke. The music left the room on its own terms, sacred, sealed, the kind of sound that authorities treated as an inheritance rather than a public gift. It was the kind of music people guarded with rules and ritual, with keys and silences. A boy walked out into that silence with a cloak pulled tight around his shoulders. He moved like someone carrying something too fragile for the daylight, careful, urgent, a little breathless. He kept his head down, not out of fear, but out of attention. The melody was with him as if it lived behind his eyes. He had heard it once, and it would not unhook itself. He had not taken a page from a desk or a sealed folio. He had taken the sound itself, folded it into memory, and had slipped it into his bones. He did not write it down immediately. He had promised himself to remember it whole, like a lock picked clean and left intact. The chords and the hush had been so specific that he almost mistrusted notation. Ink distilled nothing of the way a particular cadence had brushed the hollow of the chapel. Stillness was part of the theft. He walked through the city with that chorus playing under his ribs, watching lantern lights strike paving stones, feeling the echo of sung notes chase him around corners. The world of keys and guardians existed outside that echo. The music cut through it. At home, he sat at a narrow table under a single candle. His hands were wet from the night, and the cloth of his cloak left a faint smell of incense. He dipped a quill, held his breath, and began to put the sound onto paper. He would not copy. He would release. The ink met the page like someone making a map out of memory. When he lifted his head, there it was, lines of notation that matched the way the harmonies had sat in the chapel's air. He had not taken a thing that belonged to another person. He had made the music portable, public, a form that could cross walls. That act was simple and violent. A private hearing turned into a public thing. It was not theft in the ordinary sense. It was a removal of monopoly. In a city where certain sounds were treated as sacraments of power, he had practiced trespass for the sake of listening. He understood intuitively that music belonged to the living ear, not to the stone or the throne that tried to own it. Memory, in his hands, became a kind of liberation. He could not have known then how that single night would stand in the shape of his whole life. People would later speak of him as a prodigy, as a child of odd fortune. They would not always see the crime and the courage braided together in that quiet candle-lit page. Years ahead, when his name would be threaded into rumor and praise, the city would forget to mark where he was buried. A common grave would swallow his bones while his tunes circled rooms and crossed borders. But the night in Rome remained, a private rebellion that proved how small laws could not keep the sound down. The music he had carried out of the chapel kept on speaking, louder than any key, truer than any seal. He was 5, and he arrived at the keyboard like someone who had always known the way the world was supposed to move. His fingers barely reached the keys. They reached just enough. He did not practice in the way other children practice drills. He did not obey scales as a task. He lived inside the sound. Notes came out of him the way breath came out of lungs, necessary, immediate, indifferent to schedule or approval. Between spells of fever and nights when his small body trembled, he composed as if he were racing a storm. The music was urgent because he believed, without argument, that a day could drown the sound. He wrote between coughs and whispers, on carriages and in cheap inns, on the laps of hosts who would later tell the story as if it were an anecdote. They remembered his hands, the tilt of his head, the sudden hush that dropped over a room the moment he began. The hush was not silence. It was listening, made visible. Leopold watched him with a face split between pride and alarm. Pride, because in his son the impossible revealed itself plainly. A child with such command that strangers called it a miracle. Alarm because miracles demanded management, and management meant contracts, schedules, compromises. Leopold loved the talent, but he also saw the world outside their door. Courts with temper, patrons who measured art by coins, officials who gilded obedience. In those faces he read a question he could not answer. How do you hold genius in a household that keeps ledgers? On cold mornings, the little boy would be tucked into a carriage and sent into rooms full of people who thought themselves unshakable. He would be placed before the piano, a small figure against a sweep of curtains and candlelight, and begin. A single chord could tilt a face. People tightened their hands on glasses. Conversations froze mid-sentence. The most seasoned courtier would lower his eyes. In the marketplaces and the back rooms of taverns, the same thing happened, only rougher. Laughter died. Mugs stopped. A drunk straightened as if a bell had rung. No one asked him to do this. No one taught him to take the air out of a room. He did it because he heard music the way others heard conversation. He expected to be heard. He expected the world to change its posture around what he played. That expectation was not arrogance. It was a fact he had learned by the age of 5. Sound changed behavior. Behavior changed outcomes. If music could make people still, it could make them think, bow, rebel, or cry. He began to test the edges of that power just by playing. Children are rarely persuasive witnesses. Their truths are dismissed as noise. In his case, the truth arrived wrapped in sentences no child could explain. He would play a bar, and an elder would blink as if remembering a grief. He would land on a cadence, and a noble would forget his title for a moment and fold into private sorrow. The room would rearrange itself around the music, and where adults sought to reassert order, they instead found themselves listening. That was dangerous to the order. It suggested a logic the powerful did not control. Word traveled in small, insistent waves. Patrons whispered about the child who did not learn so much as command. Invitations came with tight smiles. Offers came with ceilings attached. Leopold accepted what he could. He taught discipline when it was possible. He taught patience and the merciless calendars of travel. He tried, as any father would, to put boundaries around something that refused them. But boundaries were only maps. The boy's life was the territory. He was not a saint of sound. He had moods and tantrums. He had childish mischief that broke a plate or mocked a rigid tutor. When he laughed, it was a sound that seemed to say the world was still improvable. When he sulked, it had the far-off tone of someone bargaining with the air. He could be cheeky with guests, imitating an impertinent phrase and making a room bloom into laughter that had the tang of danger. That danger. The laughter belonged to him as much as to the joke. He found ways to puncture solemnity with a glance or a phrase, and in doing so taught people to measure the mess of their own reverence. It became clear, painfully clear and early, that his presence would make enemies of the best people. The ones who would later become his adversaries did not come with malice at first. They came polite, with titles and cushions, and they smiled while asking for less. Condense, an impresario advised. Make it suitable. Make it smaller. A patron, after a concert that had left the aristocracy oddly moved and slightly unsettled, told Leopold, "Your son, in time, must learn to be contained." Containment in those courts meant a kind of living shrink-wrap, convenience over honesty, decorum over honesty, a serviceable art rather than an unsettling truth. He could not contain himself. Containment felt like a refusal to breathe in the full sense of the word. He did not simply disobey the request. He could not even imagine obeying it. To play smaller was to lie to himself. To temper a passage because it was inconvenient was to hand his hearing over to someone else's ledger. He understood the economics of obedience perfectly well. He watched the ledgers and the handshakes. But understanding did not mean acceptance. He would not negotiate his sound for shelter. The world tried other methods. It flattered him in public and tutored him in private. It gave him small triumphs so the larger trouble might be ignored. It rewarded technical feats to keep the dangerous curiosity busy. Those rewards were like sugar offered to a child who wanted a map to the stars. He took the victories when they were useful, but remained largely uninterested in applause that smeared the edges of a passage until it meant nothing. He sought the moment when a note opened like a door and, for a breath, let in the possibility of change. At night, after performances, he would lie awake and listen to the house fall into its usual rhythms. The wood settled, the candles dropped to a guttering whisper, and somewhere in the house a clock kept an indifferent time. In the dark, he would sometimes hum fragments he could not yet name, not because he sought acclaim, but because the music occupied him in a way no other hunger did. It was not even a hunger to be seen. It was hunger to complete a sentence he had heard inside himself, as if the sound were a sentence someone else had left unfinished. What made him uncontainable was not merely talent. It was an internal logic that treated sound as moral material. For him, a cadence was not decorative. It was an assertion. A modulation was not a clever trick. It was a proposition. He did not write to please. He wrote to test what possibility the world still had. That made him dangerous to guardians, to patrons, to men whose authority relied on silence in certain corners. Leopold watched those tensions like a man watching a precarious flame. He loved what the boy could do. He feared what the world would ask in return. He could see the ledger closing in on freedom. He could hear the phrase that would haunt his son's life: make smaller. He made a life decision then, half out of hope, half out of stubbornness. He would carry the boy into the rooms that opened, and he would trust the music to find its own way. The early tours taught the boy the currency of reaction. He learned that a single chord could lengthen a handshake or shorten a favor. He learned that sound could be a lever. That knowledge settled into him like a second skin. It would guide choices later, when offers came with mouths full of honey and hands that reached for control. Later, when directions would be given, and he would refuse them with a phrase or a pause. For now, he was simply a child who could not, would not, be turned down low. He played, and the world listened, and the fact that the world sometimes asked for less only hardened his refusal to comply. He hadn't signed up to be small, and he would not start. The court in Salzburg looked from the outside like any careful machine of power: polished floors, schedules, a calendar of favors. Inside, the music room was a small cathedral of etiquette. Chairs lined up like minor officials. A conductor's nod had as much weight as a written order. For most musicians, it was a ladder: steady rungs to climb. Perform. Be useful. Be remembered by the ledger. For him, it was something else entirely. For him, the court was a prison that called itself a shelter. He had taken the post with the archbishop because his father had taught him the language of choices: stability here, possibility later. The role had a name and a roof and regular meals. It had a promise that comfort would be traded for obedience. On paper, the offer looked like success. On the inside, it began to feel like a set of handcuffs. The orchestra pit smelled of rosin and old velvet. Players moved like people who had learned to make their silence serviceable. There were rules written and unwritten. No improvisation beyond the agreed margin. No nods that stirred a room into thought. No daring modulations unless the patron asked for them. The job was not to change the audience, only to keep them entertained while the world ran the way it had always run. It wanted music as wallpaper. He refused to be wallpaper. He treated every bar as a sentence and every rest as punctuation. He delivered his parts not because a clock told him to, but because a phrase demanded finish. He handed in pages when they matched what he heard in his head, not when a secretary stamped a due date. That small rebellion looked like temper at first. It looked like ego. With time, it exposed the friction between a living voice and a system built to keep all voices manageable. Tension accumulated like fog. Patrons who paid for ritual sensed discomfort and called it impertinence. Administrators who balanced books and reputations called it unreliability. They used polite words, timeliness, discipline, suitability, but what they meant was control. He heard their phrases and felt them as prescriptions to mute a part of himself. He could not obey. He had not been taught to reduce his hearing to fit a form. He had been taught to listen until the world changed. The personification of that pressure was a man named Arco, an official with a polite face and a precision in his step. Arco wore authority the way others wore their best coats. He assumed respect would bend like a ledger under his signature. He watched schedules and seized the instinct to correct what he thought disordered. Where musicians saw possibility, Arco saw a risk to the household's balance. He loved order more than music when the two argued. The collision happened out of minutes and irritation, a delayed score, a loud phrase in the wrong place, an improv that embarrassed and invited noble. Arco's corrections were not whispered. They were administrative. They arrived as letters and cautions. He began to close doors where, previously, doors had opened. One morning, worn, tired, and perhaps a little too blunt, Arco confronted him in the corridor. Words hardened into a shove, a literal push that was meant to be a final reminder of rank. The shove had the concrete cruelty of sure men who believed force could solve what argument could not. He left with one shoe half untied and a note of astonishment steady in his chest. The shove made a private public. The court's consensus, that he could be contained, was written onto his back by another man's boot. Shame traveled faster than gossip. The story spread with the delighted malice of those who find a scandal amusing. They pushed him out, they whispered. It was funny to some, humiliating to others, and devastating in the precise way only small betrayals by decorum can be. It made dignity a commodity to be managed. But the shove did something else that mattered more. When his shoulder hit the threshold and the doors swung closed behind him, something in his spine straightened that had not been straight before. The physical act became a punctuation mark under an idea. He did not just leave a job. He left with a signature stamped on his life. This person was not a servant by design. The shove announced his refusal in the bluntest language a court could understand. He walked into the street with the echo of the shove in his ribs and the clarity of consequence in his mind. There would be no roof that guaranteed bread and heat. There would be letters about unpaid debts, rooms that grew cold too quickly, and nights where coal had to be rationed like contraband. The ledger would close its teeth around him in ways his family would feel. He knew it. He had watched ledgers. He had mapped out the arithmetic of scarcity. Yet he also understood, with the sharpness of someone who had been forced to choose, that freedom sometimes came with an upfront cost. The air outside the court felt different after the shove, brisk and honest in a way the padded halls never were. It carried noises that the orchestra pit filtered out, tavern laughter that smelled like smoke and unscripted life, the clatter of wheels that did not need permission to move. The city had edges there, places where one could be small and loud and unfinished all at once. He breathed it in. The shove, meant to diminish, had become a resolution. He adopted the bruise as a mark of distinction. He did not naively imagine the easy triumph of a sudden independence. He knew the days ahead would be arithmetic, eating a patch of bread for the cost of true phrasing, sitting by a cold fire to buy a measure that no patron would underwrite. He envisioned the solitude of composing by candle stubs, and the humiliation of letters demanding payments he could not answer. He also saw, with that same clear-eyed arithmetic, that a measure of music written true might outlast a lifetime of small comforts. He weighed those futures and chose the one that made more sense for the sound he could not betray. The first nights were harsh. Rooms were colder than his memory of the Archbishop's Gardens. The quiet was fuller and more accusing. Debts wrote themselves across tables. Friends offered coins and then exhausted their offers. But there was a raw honesty to the new life. Each blank page he filled was paid in a different currency: integrity. He found quickly that life outside the court required negotiation of another kind, between hunger and resolve, between crude bills and exquisite chords. He began to learn how to spend his talent without selling its core. The shove became a story he told himself when the wood stove guttered. It sounded less like a humiliation and more like a proclamation. He pressed its memory into the spine of his days, a tactile lesson about what he would not yield. In taverns, he listened for patrons who valued spectacle over truth, and he learned which rooms he could enter and which he could not. He began to trade convenience for confrontation with a deliberate economy. The world would ask him to be small again and again. Each time he would remember the push and decide anew. What the shove had done, what the court and Arco intended in that moment to silence, was to make his refusal audible. It was a bruise written into the ledger of his life that he read as an instruction. If they would mark him with force, he would mark them back with music. The signature under his freedom was not an official seal, but a decision. From now on, his practice would be his law. He would play by the rules of what he heard, not by the rules of what kept rooms warm. The first cold nights were only the currency required to learn that lesson. The hall smelled of wax and velvet, and the sort of confidence that money buys. Candles burned in polished sconces. Faces were powdered and settled into the comfortable geometry power produces. He sat at a small table where scores were signed and deadlines stamped. The emperor himself glanced down at the manuscript, fingers moving over the ink as if testing its weight. A room that knew its own importance listened like someone who believed no surprise could reach them. He watched the emperor look at the page and then at him. The man who controlled permission, pay, and prestige folded the paper back and put on a smile that had been practiced in court circles for years. "Too many notes," someone said, quietly, as if naming a sin. The phrase landed in the room like a clean, cold object. Too many notes. Too much. Too much made the powerful uneasy because it could not be filed into a ledger. Too much suggested excess, and excess threatened systems organized around restraint. That idea, too many. Notes didn't mean a technical defect. It meant one more idea than the world could comfortably hold. One extra bar that made a hand tremble, one cadence that slipped out from under etiquette and landed on an open face. He heard the words and did not argue. He smiled instead, not a smile of flattery, but a small, precise acknowledgement. He knew what the request really was. It was not about trimming measures. It was about silence. They asked him to shrink his hearing, to trim his truth down to acceptable noise. He brought them The Marriage of Figaro. He wrote it the way someone writes the address on a sealed envelope when they want the world to receive a message it has been trying to ignore. The plot read like a ledger upended. Servants who planned and thought and loved more richly than their masters. Jokes that cut like quietly sharpened knives. A mirror turned on privilege. When the curtain rose, the sound broke a pattern the room had learned to take for granted. The score leaned forward where it was supposed to lie down. Laughter came first. It started in small bursts, an understated chuckle here, a surprised snort there, then rolled like a herd released. It hit the ceiling and came down like rain on a tin roof. That laughter was not the frivolous, polite applause the court had mastered. It was a noise that resembled recognition and betrayal at once. People laughed because the music told them unsteady truths about themselves in the manner of a friend who refused to flatter. Censors sharpened their scissors. Protocol officers frowned and rearranged their documents. Someone in a back room wrote a complaint and invoked phrases about decency and order. They attempted surgical edits. A bar here, a line there. The scissors clipped notation like fingers cutting thread. The official language sounded weighty, impropriety, incitement, unsuitable tone, and it landed on the production like a neutral, bureaucratic rain. But the cuts were blunt instruments against the thing the music did. Comedy was a pressure that leaked around the edges of censorship. Where a razor removed a phrase, a look or an orchestral fill filled the air with subtext. Slapstick timing, a quick harmonic shift, a small dissonance. The theater learned to speak in between the cuts. The audience began to translate. They read the jokes as instruction and the instruction as permission. At a moment when a noble expected decorum, he heard himself laughed at by his own echo. That was dangerous in a quiet court. He had discovered an acoustic truth. Laughter was armor and artillery at once. It disarmed seriousness and struck at authority by forcing it to appear foolish. An empire that required its subjects to be measured and manageable could not survive repeated exposures to its own farce. The more the officials tried to tighten rules and trim phrases, the more inventive the stage became at delivering the point. Jokes folded into meaning. Meaning found new jokes. To him, the success of Figaro was not merely applause. It was confirmation that his refusal to make music safe had leverage. He had learned how to make people listen to what they preferred to ignore. He had learned how a melody could carry a question that a sermon could not. That evening, the hall had tilted in a way the ledger did not record. Protocol had been rattled, and the rattling sounded like opportunity. But the world also took notes. Those in power catalogued the danger and began to plan containment in subtler ways than before. They would prepare new rules, new expectations, new polite phrases, suitable, concise, serviceable, to be used as measures of compliance. Too many notes became a shorthand for trouble. He knew the price of pressing the margin. He also knew the value. On the stage, the servants continued to outmaneuver their masters. Offstage, the masters rewrote definitions of good taste. In the middle stood the composer, smiling because he understood the exchange. He had made the room laugh, and, with that laughter, cracked the armor of decorum. He had played one more note than comfort allowed, and that single extra sound had changed the room's geometry. That was his method. Give the world a reason to listen to what it hated to hear, and then refuse to make that sound small. He walked into the lodge like a man who had learned to read the room by ear. The door closed behind him. Torchlight swallowed the corridor and turned faces into planes of shadow and gold. It was not theater. It attempted no spectacle. It was a place where people spoke in shapes, hand signs, short phrases, the economy of symbols that meant more than paragraphs. He joined not because he wanted a secret handshake, but because he recognized a shared premise. People could choose who they were, even against the walls that tried to hold them. The Masons did not promise miracles. They offered a practice, a sequence of trials, stories, metaphors that trained a listener to look past immediate comfort. In that room, under the hollow of torch smoke, he heard conversations about courage and testing, and the work required to build a better self. That vocabulary matched something he had been doing at the keyboard all along. Asking sound to teach, to move, to point toward a change. The lodge did not give him a plot. It gave him a map for the sort of drama he would set to music. When he wrote The Magic Flute, he was not inventing a trick. He was composing an operatic manual, an initiation laid out in melody. The characters moved through trials, darkness, fire, water, silence, and each trial was a comment on what a person might become if they were willing to be seen and tested. The score folded initiation rites into tunes people could remember after they left the theater. It disguised lessons in laughter and lodged them in the ear as if they were amusement. The mind carried the moral home without noticing it had carried anything heavy. The premiere hit like a bright coin thrown into a crowd. For the first time in years, he watched an audience settle into something that felt less like civic duty and more like participation. Children laughed out loud. Fathers leaned forward. Lovers clutched each other at the sudden pleasures. The music had a kind of magnetism. It pulled attention, and then refused to let it go. The box office filled. For nights, the theater glowed with the bright, simple economics of success. Tickets sold, ushers moved, lights burned. The applause felt true because the applause came from people who had been moved rather than instructed. Success changed the rhythm of his days for a moment. There were dinners that lasted past midnight, letters of congratulations that smelled of wax and civility, and a cash flow that finally eased some small edges. Coal noted on ledgers, a roof that stopped whistling at the seams. He tasted relief, and it was strange and brief, like a foreign wine. But the relief was always only an instrument, short and designed to be returned. The night of triumph was a flash, bright, immediate, and then gone. The effect was like a strong flame that warmed but burned fingers if you held on too long. Backstage, where the magic was patched and repaired, he felt the flash fade faster. The dressing room smelled of sweat and starch. The excitement from the footlights could not cover the practical details, schedules, payments to singers, the small quarrels that appeared when money was at stake. He learned that applause did not pay every bill, and that praise did not always protect a man from judgment. Still, for the first time in a long run of lean nights, he could look at a page of a score and imagine a short pause before a line that said, "For once, maybe we can breathe." He stepped out into the night after a performance, the torchlight memory clinging to his coat, the city's chill sliding into his bones. The air was clean. The river moved like a long, cool thought. He kept the taste of victory in his mouth, and the awareness that victories changed nothing fundamentally. They only rearranged what counted as urgent. That rearrangement, momentary as it was, gave him a new angle on the work. He had proven that an idea could sell, that people would pay to be initiated. The proof was a dangerous kind of power, because it taught him and others that art could move markets as well as minds. The danger arrived not as rumor, but as formality. A man in a plain coat and even plainer face came with a package that smelled faintly of money and midnight. He delivered a commission in neutral tones and with a signature that meant nothing in itself and everything when placed on a ledger. It was an order for a work that talked about death, an odd fit beside the warm glow of fairy tale initiation. But will and commerce have strange tastes. The courier left the papers like a polite statement and did not linger for thanks. When the envelope was opened, the room seemed to tilt. The commission was straightforward and opaque, composition for a mass, with a deadline and with conditions that hinted at a third party's pressure. The terms smelled of urgency, of someone who wanted the work completed under constraint and would not be told later that the composer needed time. The debt of the world had a way of coming due at inconvenient moments, when success had only recently softened the edges and the man believed for a little while that he might have bought time. He felt the pulse of responsibility shift. The joy of the theater had not yet cooled when the shadow of obligation arrived, and the shadow had teeth. He understood at once. The same society that had applauded his initiation opera could just as easily commission a Requiem. The torchlight nights and the midnight dispatches were part of the same civic economy. That realization had the taste of iron. He did not speak much about the commission that night. He walked through streets still humming with residual applause and thought of structure, how to hold a narrative that folded life into ritual. He had written initiation into music. Now someone asked him to write ritual around death. Both projects demanded clarity of line and truth of feeling. Both could not be compromised without shrinking the power they offered. He felt the weight of the choice, the ledger, balancing between public warmth and a private summons. The torchlight evening had given him a view from a small summit. The messenger's envelope was the next ridge to climb. He understood that success and summons would ride together, that celebration and cold duty were seldom separated. He tucked the papers into his coat and walked home with the music of the night still in his head, a melody that had taught an audience to be brave, and an envelope that asked him to answer death with sound. A plain courier had come at dusk with a packet wrapped in cheap paper, and a look that was careful not to meet anyone's eyes. He handed the envelope over without ceremony, counted coins onto the table as if making a ledger entry, and left before anyone could ask his name. The payment was real and immediate. The signature on the contract was a mark that could buy silence. The conditions read like orders, a deadline with the bluntness of a sentence, clauses that left no margin, specifications that felt like a guard waiting at the door. The commission was for a mass, for music meant for the dead, and the tone of the request smelled less of reverence than of urgency. He accepted it because art sometimes answered a call no one else heard. At first, the work looked like business, a brief, a timetable, a deposit. He sat at the table, opened the packet, took in the sums and the dates, and arranged his life around them the way a captain sets a course. The practical mind can always treat the imperative as a problem to be solved, and for a while he did. Measures, instruments, textures, a schedule for rehearsal. But then, in the quiet between the planning and the writing, something inside him clicked. It was not a sudden revelation as much as an inward switch that flipped the commission from contract into conversation. He started to write as if answering a summons from a presence rather than a signature. The paper filled with lines that looked like bookkeeping at first, then like a confession. Melodies that had been playful and bright turned inward. Harmonies that had once suggested mischief now bowed under a darker gravity. Each notation felt less like ink and more like a letter to someone unseen. He had begun the Requiem as job, and it became a testament. Physical changes followed fast. He ate less because his hands wanted the page more than the bread. He coughed at night. The cough was thin and sharp like wind through a shutter. Friends noticed the weight leaving him and warned him to rest. His wife begged him to sleep, to slow, to let the body catch up. He smiled at their concern as if from the other side of a door, tender, present, but locked. The music had its own timetable now. His body mattered only insofar as it could deliver what the notes demanded. He worked with an intensity that made ordinary hours collapse. He composed through fever, through a dry throat and thin nights. The Requiem seemed to ask for particulars that reached deeper than any commission he had taken. Not just the sound of mourning, but the anatomy of farewell, the texture of a last breath. Bars were not counted in measures, but in small reckonings. A pause that felt like crossing from ice to open water. A suspended cord that held the shape of someone's leaving. He wrote as if he were walking over thin ice, knowing it might crack, and not because he wanted to test courage, but because the piece itself required the risk. He did not hide what was happening. The production of the music revealed the price. He did not dramatize it. He simply let the truth of his body show in the pages. That honesty became a kind of pressure that held the audience. The friends who watched him work, the students who took up themes he left unfinished, the readers of his letters. It was not engineered suspense. It was exposure. The man composing in daylight that turned shallow, a composer whose hands recorded the erosion of his own reserves. Throughout it all, he did not speak of fear. There was no spectacle of martyrdom. He moved forward because there was no room to be afraid. There was only room to answer. The Requiem demanded him in full, with the blunt economy of an obligation that both tightened and liberated. In the end, his work read like a conversation with the thing that takes everything, not an accusation, but an accounting. He paid with days and strength, and what he received in return was a music that did not flinch, a piece that wore the fact of loss like a truth, not a costume. He came home to small rituals that were almost cruel in their ordinary truth. The creak of the stair, the smell of boiled cabbage, the soft argument over whether to save a coin for coal or buy a good piece of paper. The room was narrow and warm in the way houses are warm when two people try to keep a life going. His wife moved like a tide around him, practical, patient, sharp-eyed about what the day would demand. Love lived in small appliances and in the way she tucked his scores into a corner so they would not be bent. But love did not pay for coal, and every morning the ledger on the table showed the same tired arithmetic. On the mantel, the sugar bowl sat empty more often than not, a tiny domestic scandal that spelled the larger truth. There were mornings when the stove took a single lump of wood and made one dull fire that would not last the day. He would stand at the window and watch the smoke of other houses climb thick and whole while his own chimney made a thinner thread. Math of survival pressed in on everything. Paper for ink, bread for hunger, coals for the candle that let him right past the hour of charity. These were not romantic details. They were the ledger of an artist who refused the tidy trade-off. Sell your voice and buy your heat. He met the pressure with a laugh that surprised people because it was so big it did not fit the room. It was not a careless laugh. It was an armor laugh, a loud, slightly vulgar laugh that said, "I will not let despair make a quiet home inside me." He could break into a grin that flattened pretension and made a visiting noble shift uneasily in his chair. With friends he joked about the sugarless tea. With creditors he kept the joke a shade darker. The joke was a measure. It converted humiliation into a story that could be told later, embroidered and shared. Laughter became currency in itself. It bought him an easing of shame among those who loved him. When nights were raw and the accounts read like accusations, he and his companions would go to the tavern and set up a game of skittles. It was a crude sport, wooden pins and a ball, and there the rules were simple, the stakes immediate. They played loud because sound filled the space where worry waited. He bowled with deliberate clumsiness, overturned scores, challenged boys half his age, and cackled at his own misses. The game was a ritualized break with seriousness. In the alley, while a pint steamed in his hand, he became ridiculous by choice. That deliberate ridiculousness kept him from being hollowed out by the finer indignities of debt and scorn. It was not escape so much as a practiced resistance. If you could make a room laugh, you could keep the room from pitying you, and more importantly, you could keep pity from settling inside yourself. Letters arrived like small storms. An envelope with a red seal, a hurried hand asking for payment, a summons that implied worse consequences if ignored. Each one thudded onto the table as if the paper itself weighed something. He opened them with the weary politeness of a man who had learned to read scarcity. Some letters were short and businesslike. Others had the brittle righteousness of men who believed that leadingers were themselves moral law. They asked for money he did not have, or for instruments he had pawned, or for debts that were whispered as gossip in rooms where his name was currency to be spent. The notices forced him into a game he had never wanted to play, the arithmetic of shame. There were jokes from rivals in the press and in private, a cutting remark about his appetite for expense, a small caricature in a pamphlet that showed him with pockets turned out, a rival's laugh that disguised envy. Those barbs could have felt like blows, but they instead became fuel. He returned mockery with mockery, invented a story about a lost receipt, or wrote a line in a score so poking that it answered a taunt with a melody. The music itself allowed a kind of private retort. A joke in a trio or a sudden harmonic twist on stage could be read by those who knew the language. In public, he could be cheeky, irreverent, tender, and humiliatingly human all at once, and that range became a strategic advantage. Sometimes a small luck arrived. A short commission, a payment from a grateful patron, a student's fee left in an envelope under a plate. Those moments were bright and quick like struck matches. They warmed the kitchen for a night, bought a sack of coal, kept the candle lit for another page. The relief was never large, never permanent, but it carried them through the week. Each sudden gain was a reminder that his world was not only arithmetic and letters of demand. There was also appetite for what he did. That appetite arrived irregularly and without guarantee, but when it did, it was loud enough to make the heart beat differently for a while. Then would come another fall, an unpaid invoice, a cancelled benefit performance, a student who could not come through. The pattern had no linearity. It looked instead like a jagged line on a pulse monitor. Every 90 seconds, in the editorial rhythm of his life, some small event struck. The postman rattled the latch with a summons. A neighbor shouted a warning about bailiffs. A friend arrived with a scrap of cash and an apology. Nothing allowed a complacent arc. There was no smooth success to ride. The days were a sequence of sharp peaks and troughs that demanded constant improvisation. He learned to be theatrically irresponsible about comfort and scrupulous about composition. He treated his rooms like rehearsal pits, untidy, alive, necessary. He ate badly and worked brilliantly. He drank to loosen a thought, and then wrote with the loosened thought nailed down into the page. He could be appallingly irreverent to form, and absurdly exacting with a rhythm that had to be true. That contradiction was essential. It kept him human. It kept the music raw and unpolished in the places that mattered. What held the household together, besides the small cash injections, was a stubborn refusal to be reduced to numbers. His wife could scold him for extravagance, and then sit beside him as he worked, smoothing a scrap of paper into place. Friends who believed in him offered what they could: an instrument on loan, a player for a performance, a meal tucked into a coat pocket. Those gestures were not charity in the mawkish sense. They were tactical alliances. They were the social capital of a man who made others feel larger by refusing to be small. He kept a private ledger as well, one that never left the top drawer, pages where small triumphs were recorded, the perfect cadence, the burst of applause from an audience who did not know why they were moved. A student who finally played a passage true. Those entries were a counterpoint to the bills. When the world threatened to reduce his life to arrears and notices, he read those pages like a surgeon reads the pulse of a patient. They were proof that the work mattered. They were evidence against despair. In the end, laughter was both shield and declaration. When creditors rapped at the door and the sugar bowl stayed empty, he would set a bowl of figs on the table, light a candle with a theatrical flourish, and tell a story that turned the room into a stage. The sound he could make with 3 chords could reset the mood of a household and push back the quiet danger of resignation. It did not solve the accounts. It did something more immediate and dangerous. It kept a voice in the room that refused to be bought into silence. That voice was his instrument and his defense. And as long as it remained, as long as he could make the world laugh without lying to itself, the music would find the narrow spaces it needed to be born. He learned to carry grief the way musicians carry a motif, repeating it under everything else until it became the thing that set the tempo. When his father died, the house did not crack like thunder. It slid into a long, low silence that filled rooms and pockets and invoices. The loss arrived as a practical thing first, a name that would not sign a sheet, a hand that would not steady a travel plan, and then as an interior weight. He went through the motions of burial and condolences, and the city kept talking as if life had not tilted. Inside him, something else had changed. The lightness that had once been his default, sharp, quick, mischievous, stayed on the surface like a practiced smile. Under it, a pit opened. Don Giovanni came out of that pit. On paper, it read like an entertainment, a libertine, a chase, a comedy's teeth. In performance, it became the weather of a man who had lost a compass. The music delivered laughter and cunning in equal measure, but somewhere between the arias, a shadow leaned forward. When the commotion of seduction and mockery was over, when applause had hammered and the actors had bowed, the story kept going in its own way. The stone statue of the Commendatore stepped down from its plinth and asked to be heard. The theater stopped pretending it was only theater. The statue's voice was not a theatrical trick. It landed like an accusation. It did not sing to be pretty. It spoke to take account. In that scene, the stage became a courtroom and a grave at once. The character who had laughed at consequences now faced something immovable. He watched as the audience stopped congratulating itself for being entertained and started listening like a jury. The music shifted. No more playful cadences, no more clever glissandi to distract. The harmony tightened into a line that led straight to a door. He recognized that line because he had been hearing it for years in other forms. The push out of the Archbishop's house, the whispered requests to be smaller, the shove that had become a signature on his life. Here in Don Giovanni, the stone figure's invitation, "Follow me," was not an aria trophy. It was a life question delivered in bass and pedal point. He had written the score, and he had lived a version of its cruel mechanics. The moment on stage unfolded like a mirror held too close. The audience saw their own complacencies reflected and found them suddenly vulnerable. He reacted not by flinching, but by listening harder. The music allowed him to name things that previous jokes had skirted: guilt, the cost of mimicry, the absence left by those you loved and did not save. His lightness did not vanish. It became sharper, as if trimmed by the edge of grief. Where before he had softened a character's fault with a wink, now he let the flaw stand and exposed its contour. The laughter in the hall changed tone. It was still laughter, but it carried a new quality, a startled recognition that what had seemed harmless was a test of what people would do when faced with the stone. Off stage, he felt the loss like a draft. He slept less. He wrote more. The work took on an urgency that no patron could measure. Don Giovanni was no longer merely a success to place under his belt. It was an instrument for asking the world what it owed to itself. He began to cut out consolations from his music. Where he might once have smoothed a phrase to win applause, he now let a dissonance hang and made the audience live with it. He traded easy satisfaction for a stubborn truthfulness. The theater could heal only by making the wound visible. People noticed. Some found the change bracing and true. Others found it unnerving. Critics who wanted a neat triumph complained that the drama had become too heavy. Admirers who loved his old grace missed the soft cushion of irony. But there were also listeners who heard, in the sudden gravity, something like their own private grief finally given a public sound. They came out of the house altered, quieter, as if a conversation had been had for them that they could not have started on their own. That scene with the statue became a hinge in his work. It taught him that the stage could be more than a place to perform skill. It could be a place to confront inevitabilities. He stopped dressing up pain in prettiness. He let music speak bluntly about what it meant to lose a father, to be unmoored, to stand before the immovable. The result was not always pleasant. It was often honest. It made some nights awkward in the moment and lasting in the memory. He also heard, in the statue's invitation, a voice that linked back to the Requiem he had begun. A reminder that life's ledger had an entry for every song. Don Giovanni's final summons was not theatrical flourish. It was a form of reckoning. He drew from it a discipline that changed how he used his craft. Less wink, more incision. Less gentle nod, more demand. The child who had once provoked rooms with a single chord had become a man who used music to name what could not be softened. He no longer hid truth under charm. He discovered that truth could be terrifying and, sometimes, precisely the thing an audience needed to wake up. The theater filled like a held breath finally released. Night after night, people came in their best coats and their smallest lies, ready to be charmed. The magic flute landed in the world with the force of something both familiar and new. A fairy tale dressed in initiation, a comedy that would not let you leave as you came. The orchestra rose and fell. The singers found their marks. Lines that felt private in the score bloomed public under the lights. He watched from the wings, palms damp, and felt the room answer in a single collective motion. It was the kind of applause that arrived not out of obligation, but out of recognition. The sound rushed like rivers to a dam. It cracked the ordinary until everyone inside was wetter. Backstage was another country. It smelled of sweat, glue, and the iron tang of adrenaline. He moved through it like someone who had been given a brief reprieve from storms, light on his feet, oddly boyish in the way he folded his joy. He laughed easily, a laugh that had no need to prove anything, because it had already been proven by the faces in the stalls. For those nights, everything softened. The letters waiting on his table, the drafts in his rooms, the ledger's disapproving ink. For the first time in a long while, he allowed himself to resemble a man who believed the world might, at times, reward honesty with warmth. Then he would go home, and the warmth would be a surface. He returned to the Requiem in the same breath that he carried the aftertaste of triumph. The two works sat inside him like coals. One flared outward and warmed a crowd. The other kept smoldering and demanded a private tending. He worked as if the days were measured by different clocks. Public hours were bright, loud, and fast. Private hours were narrow and inexorable. There was a hidden timer he did not speak of, a sense that the Requiem's clock ticked in a rhythm that could not be slowed by praise. He set himself to the task with the focused disregard of someone who knew deadlines by the way their bones complained. Nights shortened. He slept in half-breaths, and sometimes not at all. Pens tracked across staves like footsteps down a long corridor. He wrote sections that sounded like counting, breaths, heartbeats, the way a voice measured a plea. The Requiem asked for textures no theater light could show, silence as weight, a chord that behaved like a hand closing. He found himself writing with a bluntness he had not used before, because there was no time for prettiness. Each bar became a line in a ledger of presence and absence. Physically, he frayed. He lost weight in a way that made his cheekbones sharper and his hands thinner at the knuckles. His cough came back, brief and dry, and his wife watched him with the kind of small alarms only people who sleep in the same room know how to make. Friends offered remedies and then retreated, unsure whether their help would be taken or become another obligation. He accepted food and returned to the page. Desire. Music demanded the hours he had left and spent them like a necessary tax. The contrast between the two projects, one public celebration, the other private reckoning, worked on the nerves of everyone near him. Colleagues saw the flush of success and the slump that followed the curtain call. They noticed how he would be radiant at 11 and pale at 3. Audiences who had laughed through the trials of the magic flute wrote letters that said simply, "We have rarely been so moved." The same audiences did not receive the Requiem while he lived to see its complete form. The Requiem belonged to a threshold, and he was composing right on its lip. There was no melodrama in the way he conducted this double life. He did not announce his fatigue as proof of dedication. He moved with a pragmatic surrender. The applause had its place, and the page had its demand. That practicality made his work more brutal and more honest. He let the theater's joy be pure when it happened, and let the Requiem be the dark ledger when it had to be. In that duality, the drama tightened. The viewer saw the man at the peak of applause, and then saw him return to a lamp and a sheet, and the gap between those images made a kind of gravity the spine could not resist. The nights accumulated into a pressure. The public success fed the private obligation, and the private obligation drained the public man. Yet that tension is what held attention. A spectator who watched his triumph and knew, now and again, the cost behind the curtain stayed. There was a curiosity that was not idle. If a voice could hold a room, what would it do when it had to hold dying as well? Joy and death, held in a single life, made people lean in. They wanted to see who blinked first, who would soften, who would remain unbowed. The answer was not simple, and it made the watching urgent. In those months he lived as if two scripts ran through him, each casting light on the other. The magic flute made the crowd breathe. The Requiem made a room hold its breath. Between them he existed, and the contradiction itself became an engine. That engine pulled the eyes of everyone who cared about music and about meaning. The fever of premiere nights and the hush of composition pulled him apart, and those who followed him felt the pull like a current. They stayed because they could not look away. They stayed because the man they watched refused the compromise that would have made his work forgettable. He stopped in the middle of a line, as if someone had come into the room and called his name. The quill hovered, the ink pooled, and then dried. He looked at the bar, then at the page, then at the room around him, as though searching for an echo that would tell him what to write next. He felt the work closing in on him, like weather. He did not finish because time narrowed its fingers and would not pry them open again. The Requiem held a space that no later scrawl could quite fill, the same way he might have filled it. He left motives half-shaped, phrases that paused mid-breath, and an architecture of sound asking to be completed by a hand that belonged to him, and only him. Friends and pupils were not idle in the hush that followed. They moved like people trying to push a heavy door the last few inches when the hinge has seized. They gathered scores, copied fragments, traced his handwriting until ink smudges read like instructions. Some tried to finish the piece with the devotion of people, attempting to close a wound. Some did it because the world required a finished work to perform, to catalogue, to sell. They fit their hands around motifs as if cradling a child's face, and where his ink had faltered, they supplied continuation that owed its breath to him. What they completed was not merely music. It was an act of survival for a project that had been thrust into public life while its maker was gone. The official end was small and unceremonious. He was buried without fuss in a grave shared with others, a common pit in the earth where markers and epitaphs were not spared for every dying man. There was no grand procession, no marble column, no curtain drawn in the theater. There was a municipal rhythm that moved bodies along, like things to be disposed of, neat and practical. For someone whose life had been scaled in arias and premieres, the anonymity felt obscene to some, and merely administrative to others. The absence of a stone did not erase a name. It revealed how quickly a city could fail to measure the value of a life by the noise it had once made. That indifference hurt in a way different from disgrace or public accusation. Disgrace still demanded notice, an afterword, a scandal to feed on. Indifference was quieter and colder. It was the refusal to count. The common grave was not a punishment in the sense of moral judgment. It was worse because it suggested that the world could take a man's entire life and lay it in the ground with no conversation about why it mattered. He did not die on a scaffold or with tribunals calling his name. He slipped out into an economy of indifference that treats the departed like discarded receipts. Yet the world that had failed to sign his tombstone could not keep its ears shut. The unfinished Requiem moved through rooms and salons and eventually into the hands of people who performed what they could. The gaps where his hand had stopped became, strangely, a place for listeners to enter. Where a composer usually dictated a shape from first note to last, the half-finished Requiem left a pause meant for the living to answer. That absence, paradoxically, amplified the presence. The music sounded both like a closed statement and like a question with an open mouth. Artists and audiences found themselves completing rhythms with their imaginations, setting their own breath to the tempo he had left, and thereby making the score into a collective act of listening. There was a grotesque fairness in the way incompletion worked. The piece that he could not complete became the work that invited collaboration and interpretation. It refused to be fossilized into a tidy monument. Instead, it demanded that others step into the process of giving the music life. That imperative, finish what cannot be finished alone, became an ethical as well as an artistic mandate. It forced a generation to weigh the meaning of authorship against the pressing human need to remember out loud. The students who took up the thread did not merely imitate. They argued with the motives, made choices where he had left questions, and by doing so entered into the composition as interlocutors rather than mere copyists. The Requiem, in its unclosed state, also became a mirror held up to those who listened. People who had sought shelter in routine now had to supply their own endings. The composition's incomplete bars sounded like a place where the listener's life fit, an invitation, not a demand. Where the score paused, the mind supplied a memory or a loss of its own. The unfinished work turned inward the habit of art as lecture. It asked the audience to answer as much as it asked them to applaud. In this way, the piece continued to live, not in text alone, but in the interior responses it provoked. Public neglect and private fidelity produced a strange justice. The city had refused a stone, but it could not stop the sound that kept returning to rooms and churches. Over time, the Requiem grew into an emblem. It was cited by those who spoke of mortality, by those who wanted to argue that a life could be measured in phrases and in the courage to set down a last sound. The music, even in pieces that others completed, carried a residue of his voice that could not be ironed out by later hands. In the places where his ink had ended, the music seemed to leave a notch that called out for attention. It kept people awake in ways that official memorials did not. That paradox, unfinishedness as completion, became part of his legacy. The fact that the Requiem was not closed by his hand intensified its meaning. It operated like an ellipsis at the end of a sentence whose whole force could be felt without the final word. The silence that followed the last written bar was not a failure, but a device. It placed the responsibility of closure into the hands of the living. It demanded that listeners decide what should come next. And in that demand, there was a kind of kinship. The composer had entrusted a last act to others, and thereby extended the life of his idea past the span of his own body. He left the world with that deliberate rupture, a piece waiting. The unfinished pages were not evidence of a life cut short only. They were an instrument designed to make those left behind speak. The incomplete score required faith or impatience, the two possible responses of a listener faced with a pause. Some answered with reverent completion, others with restless reimagining, and a few with scorn at the idea that a life could be left unmarked in the earth. But across those differences, one fact remained. His voice did not stop at the grave. It circulated, imperfect and insistent, through those who would not let it die voiceless. When audiences later stood in cathedrals or small salons and heard the Requiem, they encountered both a work and a wound. The unfinished phrases acted as sutures that the listening community could draw together. In performance, the pauses that once felt like absence now functioned as a task, to provide closure, to make sense, to inhabit the space between notes. His death had been administered by indifference, but his music achieved a different kind of immortality. It became a shared responsibility, a communal act of remembering that required participation. In that transformation, the composer's absence was converted into an ethical engine, memory that demanded action. The last stubborn irony was simple. The city that had refused a stone could not refuse the sound that traveled. The Requiem that had no final chord, written by its author, gained a different finality. It ended where his listeners chose it to end. That choice turned the unfinished into a living hinge between a name and a future. In the pause he had left, the living found a place to answer, not with a plaque, but with attention. The question he had left unclosed moved from the page into the chest of each listener, and there, in that private answering, his work reached something like completion. He had never been a titan because he won every argument or because the court bowed. He became one because, in room after room that asked him to quiet down, he chose not to fit. The choice was small, and then it was absolute. Do not make yourself less convenient. Do not edit the part of you that was heard. That refusal, repeated until it hardened into habit, was what looked like stubbornness, and what later was named greatness. People expected him to compress himself into acceptable measures. They wanted him shorter, simpler, softer, an instrument that would perform on cue and then be put away. He heard that ask as a request to amputate a piece of his hearing, his truth. So he did the opposite. He played extra bars. He let harmonies stray where they were not invited. He wrote scenes in which servants outwitted lords and staged jokes that made the powerful show their teeth in public. Those choices were not theatrical provocations for their own sake. They were decisions taken from a simple, internal logic. Music was not a commodity to be smoothed for comfort. It was a medium that could tell the things people pretended not to hear. Being a titan, in his practice, meant turning private insistence into public consequence. It was saying, with a timing no protocol could mistake, that sound belonged to people, not to titles. That insistence cost daily things. A warm room, measured credit, polite company. It cost social currency that could have bought convenience. It cost late payment and cold beds. It cost the quiet life. But it bought an uncompromised language. He traded warmth for the right to be heard whole. A titan did not require stage speeches. He left his mark in smaller, harder-to-measure ways, a laughter that fractured decorum, a cadence that refused to apologize, a scene that made an audience notice an unclean fact about itself. He did not cloak subversion in grand gestures. He practiced it in the clerk's hour, in the rehearsal, in the signature on a page, mailed to, late. Each small refusal stacked up. Together they built a structure that no polite ledger could contain. There was an inner architecture to his defiance. He treated melody like a proposition and silence like an accusation. Where others used music to soothe, he used it to name. His phrases were not ornamental, they were arguments. That made his work dangerous to systems that needed predictability. Power does not fear the loud. It fears what the loudness exposes: hypocrisy, cowardice, the emptiness of custom. So the titan became a problem. Systems tried to quiet him with titles, with payments, with polite reprisals. When those failed, they applied slaps thinly disguised as advice. He collected those slaps and turned them into a ledger of proof. Each blow documented what he would not sell. The cost of being such a man was not a dramatic martyrdom. It was the slow erosion of comforts, and then, perhaps, the quick arrival of misfortune. He knew the arithmetic of that choice as clearly as he knew rhythm. Stand by what you hear, and the world will make you pay in other currencies. He paid. He traded body for fidelity. He became thinner at the edges, more brittle in winter. His health faded under the weight of uncompromised creation. He died before many of those who had asked him to shrink forgot to mention his name. The payment he made was final. The price exact and terrible. Life itself used as honest currency. But there was a paradox in that finality. What he left, imperfect and sometimes unfinished, echoed stronger than any marble inscription could have. The fragments asked the living to complete them. The work did not become smaller because he had paid so much. It became larger, as if the world had to step into the space he abandoned, and, by doing so, inherit responsibility. That inheritance was the real mark of a Titan, not the applause of a single knight, but the obligation imposed on others to finish what one refused to abbreviate. Being a Titan also had a moral anatomy. It was not about vanity. It was about honesty. Titans refused easy substitutions, comfort for truth, convenience for consequence. They preferred the hard coin of fidelity to the soft coin of compromise. Their acts were not always noble in the polite sense. They were often ugly. Quarrels, debts, misunderstandings, nights in bad rooms. The ugliness mattered less than the refusal to trade away the core of being. That refusal sometimes looked selfish, but if the choice was between living as a smaller person and living true, he chose the latter every time. For those who watched him, the lesson was not a command to repeat his precise path. It was the shape of a question turned inward. What part of yourself have you been asked to make smaller? What melody have you been told to trim for the comfort of others? The Titan's example functioned as an accusation and an invitation. Either accept the mild life, tidy and warm, or accept the cost of being louder, stranger, more dangerous to the status quo. In the end, the most titanic thing he did was simple and immutable. He refused to rearrange his terms. That refusal radiated. It made others uncomfortable, and it made some secretly hopeful. It set a standard. Greatness is not measured by triumphs the world can count, but by how much of yourself you will not sell. If you found that sentence recognizable, then your war had already begun. The choice remained the same. Will you be smaller to belong, or will you risk being large enough to be remembered? He might have been born 2 centuries earlier, but the pattern of demand that chased him wore a shape that felt eerily familiar to anyone who watched the modern world with their eyes open. Power always preferred predictability. It had always liked that people could be counted, formatted, fit into a margin. In his time, it was a court that loved short, polite pieces that could be archived and forgotten. In the present, it was an algorithm that rewarded the brief, the loud, the instantly digestible. The language changed. The mechanism did not. The pressure was the same. Become convenient. From the moment his first notes upset a room, the request echoed in every form available to authority. Be shorter. Make it simple. Don't trouble people. Those were polite sentences for one command: shrink. The world was not asking him to improve. It was asking him to fit. He heard the plea the way a man hears a tight closing of a door, an invitation to safety that tasted like silence. The choice was always the same: edit yourself into a shape the system would accept, or refuse, and hope the system could be moved. He refused. When he refused, he did more than defend a musical preference. He defined a posture toward time and attention. He believed that certain truths required space to breathe, phrases that could not be clipped without losing their meaning. He wrote long lines, complicated counterpoints, and scenes that demanded patience. Those choices cost him warmth and convenience in life, but they bought him a persistence of voice that simple efficiency could never purchase. A platform that favors the short will forget the complex. A society that prefers the consumable will erode the things that require sustained attention. His answer was not calculated for virality. It was aimed at endurance. Looked at through the lens of today's attention economy, his refusal read like an anti-algorithmic manifesto. Algorithms flatten taste by rewarding what maximized clicks and completion rates. They trained a public to prefer the immediate little thrill over the slow burn. A melody that wanted to unfold across 10 minutes would be punished. A story that asked for quiet reflection would be downranked. The modern court had its own courtly language: analytics, watch time, engagement, and it spoke in metrics that rewarded predictability. When the system labeled something too long or too complex, it was repeating the same chorus that once told him too many notes. The verdict differed only in measurement. He had the option to optimize himself into a product the market would love. Bite-sized genius, a neat package, a persona engineered for smiles and attention. Many in his orbit chose that route. Talent folded into utility, nuance shaved off for performance. He saw the bargains made. He also saw the consequence. A voice that fit the shelf was a voice that faded when the shelf moved. He watched the difference in real time. Applause that flared and died, fame that blinked, reputations that were fast and shallow. He measured the cost and refused the settlement. Because he refused, he left behind a different kind of residue. Complexity resists compression. Where the algorithm eats the easy and spits out more easy, complexity sets up small traps for memory. A long phrase that carried a moral or a twist would not be scrolled past. It lodged. A difficult turn of harmony asked a listener to return. His music demanded return visits. It was a type of immunity. The deeper the structure, the less likely it was to be fully consumed by a background glance. He traded the spike of instant attention for the slow accrual of presence. There was also a moral architecture to that trade. To choose length and honesty over convenience was to assert that attention was not a commodity to be traded cheaply. It was to insist that some ideas required time and danger to exist. He had paid for that insistence with his days and his breath. The modern parallel cost looked different. Fewer views, hostile algorithms, a smaller paycheck. But the logic matched. Either the creator tuned themselves to the machine, or the creator tried to turn the machine by refusing to be tidy. He tried to do the latter. The consequence was simple and striking. Because he had refused to reduce, his music had become resistant to forgetting. The algorithm could bury 100 shallow trends, but a well-constructed idea, a phrase that contained a question and refused a tidy answer, continued to pull people back. It worked on different terms. It relied on human transmission, on community, on those who were willing to spend time. The modern listener who stumbled into that music did not find an instant snack. They found a room with furniture placed in a way that required them to stay. They found a work that would not let them be trivial. That is why he still sounded in the head of people who never saw his grave. It was not mysticism. It was strategy. He had decided, in the small, brutal choices of his life, to make art that outlived trends by being unwilling to be comfortable. Algorithms learned, adapted, and optimized against anything that reduced retention costs. He taught a different lesson. Make something that cannot be fully reduced, and the system will have to make room for it or be circled by those who care. He did not pick the easy way. He picked the way that kept his voice honest, and therefore enduring. For anyone listening now, the echo carries a question. Inside you, there is a sound someone once asked to be quieter. It might be a stubborn love of depth, an insistence on asking hard questions, a refusal to barter your best sentences for faster applause. The machine will always offer shelter in the form of simplicity. He chose the risk of persistence over the comfort of metrics. That decision is why his notes still find ears. The choice remains open to you. Edit yourself down to fit the palace of today, or stand and compose in a key broad enough to be remembered. He left them a sentence that worked like a small detonator. It was not carved on stone. It was whispered into rehearsals, scribbled at the edge of letters, folded into the last measures he would not finish. The line cut through the noise because it was simple, and because it was true in the way a confession is true. You did not choose the music. Music chose you. If it chose you, then you already owed pay. That sentence did not arrive as a moral demand. It arrived as an instruction with a price tag. It named cost in clear currency, money, which bought fuel and ink, time, which ate into dinners and sleep itself, traded for a bar more, a phrase tighter, an answer truer, and the little courtesies of everyday life, the polite compromises, the safe silences, that one surrendered with a shrug. He had paid these things as a matter of course. He had traded warmth for the right to be heard. That trade hardened into a truth people could not ignore. If something chose you, you did not bargain it down to comfort. The line settled not only on the page, but in the chest of those who heard it. It landed like a metronome tap in a quiet room, precise, unavoidable. Listeners found it lodged under their ribs, a tick that refused to quiet. Some heard it, and remembered the appointments they had kept with safety at the expense of voice. Others heard it, and felt the old tug of a half-formed idea, a manuscript in a drawer, the draft email they never sent. For many, the sentence acted like a summons. It turned passive regret into active obligation. He had not spoken the words directly to the crowd. He had left them like a relic, a small instruction left in a pocket for whoever came after. That indirectness made them sharper. People who heard them could not plead innocence. The phrase did not scold. It simply recorded fact. A choice had been made by something stubbornly not human, and now human time had to answer for that choice. The debt was not punitive. It required only attention and payment in whatever medium the life could afford. The payments took different shapes. Sometimes it looked like open defiance, a composer who refused to cut a movement, a writer who refused the easy headline, an artist who kept an exhibition open until it bruised the balance sheet. Sometimes it was quiet and stubborn, a teacher who kept a difficult passage in a curriculum despite complaints, a friend who spoke an uncomfortable truth at dinner. Payment looked like small injuries and long evenings, the kind that accrue to people who decide to keep their inner sound loud. It was not glamorous. It was precise and unrewarding in the short term, and yet it changed the skyline of what was possible. People argued about the phrase as if arguing could shift the meter. Some claimed the music that chose you was a vanity trick, a rhetorical flair for those who wanted an excuse to suffer. Others treated it as a religious calling. He had no interest in either altar. For him, the point was technical. When a thing pushed on you from the inside, when an idea persisted against all reasonable editing, that persistence became a directive. The right response was work, not ceremony. The phrase, therefore, was not a sermon. It was a blueprint. It also worked as a mirror. When listeners felt the sentence shape itself in their thoughts, they stopped blaming circumstances and began tallying internal debts. How many things had they shrunk for comfort? How many notes had they cut because an algorithm, an editor, a manager preferred a neat line? The mirror did not plead. It simply required an answer. And answers were not abstract. They were measurements, hours found, comforts renounced, conversations started. The tally was not always heroic. Often it was small, stubborn rearrangements of a life. He had wanted the line to be portable. It had to survive the loss of his body, the bureaucracies that forgot his grave, the market that preferred novelty. So he framed it not as an exaltation of suffering, but as an economic fact. You cannot have the music and the cushioned life, both. Choose. Pay. See what your voice does when you are gone. That bluntness was what made the phrase stick. It removed the romance and left the contract. The metronome ticked louder for those who stayed in the room. That tick was both a threat and a promise. It measured not only speed, but seriousness. Under its count, small lives were tested. Could someone give one late night for a complex phrase? Could someone say no to a comfortable edit? Could someone accept the social cost of being longer, stranger, more exacting than the audience expected? The metronome did not care about motives. It only registered payment. It kept score in the currency of attention. In the end, the sentence worked because it made the question immediate. It turned an abstract ideal, be true to your inner sound, into a concrete moment of choice. He had paid. Others were asked to pay in their turn. Some would decline, opting for ease and warmth and a tidy timeline. Others would step forward and meet the meter, shift resources, lose sleep, offend politely, and keep composing. The result was not guaranteed to be triumphant. Often it looked like stubborn survival. Sometimes it looked like loss. But it always looked like answer. That was the point. The phrase did not promise fame or reward. It promised agency and the obligation that comes with having heard something impossible to ignore. For those who carried it forward, the question became immediate and small. What did they owe to the sound that had chosen them? The metronome ticked. The room waited. The move was theirs.